She wasn't just a movie star, she was a revolution, a woman who changed cinema, fashion, desire, and freedom itself. Brigitte Bardot didn't follow the rules. She broke them, walked away, and never looked back. If you love classic cinema legends and untold stories, subscribe to Sajjad Classic.
What do you want?
To be beautiful and for you to love me.
Brigitte Anne-Marie Bardot was born on September 28, 1934, in Paris, France. But her childhood was anything but romantic or carefree. She grew up in a strict upper-middle-class household, where discipline mattered more than affection and appearances mattered more than emotions. Her parents believed deeply in control, etiquette, and social respectability, leaving little room for warmth or tenderness. Later in life, Bardot openly admitted that she felt unloved and emotionally isolated as a child. Praise was rare. Physical affection was almost non-existent. She learned very early to hide her feelings and retreat into herself. This emotional distance shaped her personality, quiet, introverted, and deeply sensitive beneath the surface. At school, Brigitte did not resemble the confident beauty the world would later worship. She was painfully shy, wore thick glasses, and struggled to fit in. Classmates teased her, sometimes cruelly, and she often felt invisible. Far from enjoying attention, she feared it. Crowds made her uncomfortable. Being watched made her anxious. Her escape came through music and movement. Bardot discovered ballet at a young age, and for the first time, she found something that allowed her to express emotions she could never speak aloud. Dance became her refuge, a private world where discipline felt purposeful rather than oppressive. She trained seriously at the Conservatoire de Paris, one of France's most prestigious institutions, dedicating herself to classical ballet with almost obsessive focus. Her dream was never cinema. She did not want to be an actress. She did not seek fame. Brigitte Bardot wanted only one thing: to become a professional ballerina. Ironically, it was her dedication to ballet that quietly opened the door to a completely different destiny. Her graceful posture, natural elegance, and striking presence caught the attention of photographers. A ballet photo shoot led to modeling assignments. Modeling led to magazine covers. And soon, filmmakers began to notice the young girl who moved like a dancer but looked unlike anyone else on screen. Fame was not something Bardot chased. It was something that found her, quietly, unexpectedly, and against her will. This early contradiction, a girl who craved privacy becoming the most photographed woman in the world, would define Brigitte Bardot's life. The reserved child who only wanted to dance would one day stand at the center of a cultural storm she never asked to create. And long before the world saw her as a symbol of desire and rebellion, she was simply a lonely girl in Paris, searching for peace in the silence of a ballet studio. Brigitte Bardot's introduction to fame was neither planned nor desired. At just 15 years old, she appeared on the cover of Elle magazine, photographed not as a glamorous starlet, but as a young ballet student with an unpolished, natural presence. That image quietly stunned Paris. At a time when actresses were styled to look older, dramatic, and theatrical, Bardot appeared completely different. She looked fresh, innocent, and instinctively sensual without trying to be seductive. There was no heavy makeup, no exaggerated pose, only a quiet confidence shaped by ballet training. It felt accidental, and that authenticity made her unforgettable. The cover created a ripple effect. Photographers wanted her, fashion editors wanted her. And most importantly, filmmakers began to notice a face that did not belong to the traditional studio system. Bardot represented something new, a beauty that felt real rather than constructed. Following her Elle appearance, Bardot began receiving modeling offers and soon appeared on multiple fashion and lifestyle magazine covers across France. She became a favorite subject for photographers who sensed her camera-friendly vulnerability. Each image reinforced the same impression. She wasn't posing, she was simply being. These magazine appearances played a crucial role in shaping her early public image. Bardot was marketed not as a trained actress, but as a natural phenomenon. A girl discovered, rather than created. This image would later become central to her myth. Film producers, eager to capitalize on her growing visibility, offered her small roles. Behind the scenes, Bardot was miserable. She hated acting. The constant attention made her anxious. Cameras felt intrusive. Direction confused her. She later admitted she felt exposed, clumsy, and emotionally naked in front of film crews. Acting did not come naturally to her, and unlike many aspiring stars, she had no hunger for applause. She often longed to return to ballet studios, to discipline and silence, rather than endure film sets filled with expectations she never asked for. Yet, even as she resisted, her image continued to spread. By the early 1950s, Bardot was appearing regularly in French and European magazines, her face becoming increasingly recognizable. Editors framed her as a symbol of youthful modernity, a bridge between innocence and desire. Each cover added to her visibility, tightening the grip of fame around her. Bardot did not chase success. Success followed her relentlessly. Every magazine cover increased public fascination. Every small film role expanded her exposure. What critics saw as weakness, the public perceived as authenticity. Her awkwardness read as vulnerability. Her lack of polish felt honest. Without realizing it, Brigitte Bardot was becoming a blank canvas onto which an entire generation would project its fantasies of freedom, rebellion, and desire. She made her screen debut in 1952, appearing in light romantic films and supporting parts. The roles were modest, often decorative, and rarely demanded depth. Crazy for Love, 1952. Brigitte Bardot's screen debut was quiet, modest, and almost invisible. In Crazy for Love, she appeared in a small role that barely hinted at what was coming. At the time, French critics hardly noticed her. Le Figaro dismissed the film as light entertainment, while Cinémonde mentioned Bardot only in passing, calling her pleasant but unremarkable. Ironically, that anonymity suited her. Bardot later admitted she felt safer when no one was watching. Fame had not arrived yet, but it was already circling. The Girl in the Bikini, 1952. If one film announced Bardot's physical presence to the world, it was The Girl in the Bikini. Barely 18, she appeared nearly nude on screen, a shocking image in conservative 1950s Europe. The film itself was dismissed by critics as thin and exploitative, but Bardot became its headline. Paris Match described her as a provocation disguised as innocence, while Le Monde questioned whether cinema had crossed a moral line. Audiences, however, were mesmerized. Bardot was uncomfortable with the attention. She had not chosen provocation. It had been chosen for her. The Light Across the Street, 1955. This film marked a subtle shift. Playing a woman connected to crime and emotional despair, Bardot delivered a darker, more serious performance. Critics began to sense depth behind the image. Positif praised her unexpected gravity, while Cahiers du Cinéma suggested Bardot possessed an instinctive realism untouched by technique. The praise was cautious, but real. And God Created Woman, 1956. Cinema did not survive this film unchanged. As Juliette, Bardot became the embodiment of forbidden desire. She danced barefoot, loved freely, and rejected every moral boundary imposed on women. The backlash was immediate. The Catholic Church condemned the film. Several countries banned it. Le Figaro called it dangerous, while L'Osservatore Romano labeled it immoral. But across the Atlantic, Time magazine declared Bardot a new kind of erotic earthquake, and the New York Times acknowledged her raw animal magnetism. This was not acting. This was an event. Bardot later said the film destroyed her privacy forever. Naughty Girl, 1956. Released the same year, Naughty Girl attempted to capitalize on Bardot's sudden fame. She played a mischievous young woman torn between rebellion and vulnerability. Critics were divided. Cinema 56 found her charming but limited, while Paris Match admitted she possessed an authenticity no actress could fake. Audiences loved her spontaneity. Critics still debated whether she was talent or temptation. The argument would follow her for decades. The Parisian, 1957, she played a lively Parisian woman whose youth and impulsiveness clash with Boyer's sophistication. Bardot's acting here was energetic and flirtatious, relying on timing and physical presence. The chemistry was asymmetrical. Boyer represented authority and polish, Bardot instinct and disruption. While she held the screen confidently, the role reinforced her image as decorative rather than serious. Variety noted her unforced charisma, while French critics saw the film as pleasant but shallow. The Night Heaven Fell, 1958. This film pushed Bardot into darker emotional territory. She portrayed a woman trapped in obsession and moral danger, acting opposite Alida Valli, whose controlled intensity contrasted sharply with Bardot's emotional openness. Set in an atmosphere of obsession and moral ambiguity, her performance was openly sensual and emotionally charged. Critics reacted strongly. Le Monde accused the film of exploiting her sexuality, while Cahiers du Cinéma defended Bardot, arguing that the discomfort belongs to the audience, not the actress. The controversy only fueled her reputation as cinema's most dangerous woman. Love is My Profession, 1958. This was a major turning point. Bardot acted opposite Jean Gabin, France's most authoritative male actor. She played a young woman entangled in a destructive relationship with an older lawyer. Bardot deliberately restrained her performance. She spoke less, moved less, and allowed Gabin's presence to dominate scenes. Their chemistry was intentionally unbalanced, reflecting power, dependence, and emotional damage. Le Figaro praised her restraint. Cahiers du Cinéma called it, "The moment Bardot learned silence can be more powerful than seduction." The New York Times acknowledged her dramatic credibility. For once, Bardot wasn't a symbol. She was an actress. Come Dance with Me, 1959. In this romantic drama, Bardot portrayed a woman conflicted between desire and responsibility, acting opposite Henri Vidal. She played a woman caught between desire and consequence, her performance quieter and more reflective. Critics described her as visibly exhausted. Positif noted a sadness beneath the glamour, while Variety observed that her screen energy felt subdued. Many now sensed something deeper. Fame was no longer thrilling her. The Truth, 1960. This was Bardot's most demanding role. She played Dominique Marceau, a woman accused of murder whose life is dissected publicly in court. The role required emotional collapse, anger, shame, and defiance. There was no romantic chemistry to rely on. The performance stood alone. Bardot stripped away glamour completely. Her acting was confrontational and emotionally exposed. This film silenced critics who doubted her ability. The response was overwhelming. Cahiers du Cinéma hailed her as finally undeniable. The New York Times praised her emotional nakedness. Le Monde called the film cruel, honest, and unforgettable. For the first time, critics agreed. And tragically, it was also the moment Bardot realized she no longer wanted to be seen at all. A Very Private Affair, 1962. By the early 1960s, Brigitte Bardot was no longer just acting. She was bleeding on screen. In A Very Private Affair, she played Jill, a young woman crushed by celebrity, stalked by cameras, and emotionally stripped bare by public obsession. The role felt so close to Bardot's own life that many reviewers described the film as confessional cinema. Le Monde noted that Bardot appeared less like a performer and more like a subject under examination, while Cahiers du Cinéma observed that the film exposed the violence of fame more than it celebrated beauty. The New York Times wrote that Bardot brought a strange, unsettling honesty to the role even when the film itself faltered. Behind the glamour was exhaustion, and critics sensed it. This was not a fantasy of stardom, but a warning. Contempt, 1963. If a very private affair revealed her wounds, contempt turned them into art. Directed by Jean-Luc Godard, Bardot portrayed Camille, a woman whose love dissolves not through betrayal, but through silence and pride. Her performance was restrained, distant, and emotionally cold, a sharp departure from her sensual image. Upon release, reactions were mixed. Variety found the film emotionally opaque, while French critics were divided. But Cahiers du Cinéma defended Bardot fiercely, calling her performance deceptively simple and devastating in its stillness. Over time, opinion shifted dramatically. Sight and Sound later hailed her as misunderstood in her time, and modern critics frequently cite Contempt as her most mature and intelligent performance. The irony was cruel. Just as Bardot proved she could act brilliantly, she was already growing tired of acting at all. Viva Maria, 1965. Viva Maria exploded like a firecracker. In Viva Maria, she starred opposite Jeanne Moreau, playing a rebellious entertainer swept into a revolution. The film blended comedy, adventure, and political satire, and Bardot embraced the chaos with infectious energy. The movie was a box office hit worldwide, particularly in Europe and Latin America. Time magazine praised Bardot's unruly magnetism, noting that she brought spontaneity where structure failed. The Guardian highlighted the contrast between Moreau's discipline and Bardot's raw charm, calling their pairing cinema alchemy. Bardot performed many of her own stunts and insisted on minimal makeup, reinforcing her image as untamed and fearless. This film cemented her status as a global superstar, not just a European icon. This was the last time she seemed to enjoy fame rather than endure it. 2 weeks in September 1967. This quieter romantic drama marked a visible emotional shift. Bardot played a woman torn between freedom and attachment, her performance subdued and reflective. Gone was the provocation, replaced by sadness and distance. Le Figaro described her acting as melancholic and withdrawn, while Variety noted a maturity that suggested emotional fatigue rather than growth. The film did modest business, but critics sensed Bardot was losing interest in cinema itself. Many reviewers later identified this film as an early sign of her approaching withdrawal, a star slowly stepping out of the spotlight. Shalako, 1968. Shalako paired Bardot with Sean Connery in a glossy western. But the result disappointed nearly everyone involved. She played a European aristocrat navigating danger in an unfamiliar land, yet critics found the film hollow. The New York Times criticized the lack of chemistry, while Variety called the project a triumph of casting over storytelling. French magazines were harsher. Positif argued that Bardot looked visibly disengaged, and Bardot herself later dismissed the film as emotionally empty. Rather than expanding her global appeal, Shalako reinforced her belief that international stardom came at too high a personal cost. Trivia. Bardot reportedly disliked the production, the environment, and the rigid structure of Anglo-American filmmaking, reinforcing her refusal to move permanently to Hollywood. The Bear and the Doll, 1970. Strange, whimsical, and misunderstood, The Bear and the Doll showed Bardot retreating into fantasy. She portrayed a woman living close to nature, rejecting society and conventional romance. Critics were split. Le Monde admired the film's gentleness, while Cahiers du Cinéma praised Bardot's comfort in a role that mirrored her real-life desire for isolation. Other outlets found it lightweight, but many noted how at peace she seemed on screen, especially in scenes involving animals and solitude. In retrospect, the film feels less like a performance and more like a rehearsal for the life she would soon choose. Don Juan, or If Don Juan Were a Woman, 1973. This was Bardot's final statement, and her most controversial. Reversing the Don Juan myth, she played a woman who seduced, discarded, and dominated men. Directed by Roger Vadim, the film provoked outrage and confusion. Le Figaro dismissed it as indulgent, while Variety criticized its lack of narrative discipline. Feminist critics were divided. Some saw it as subversive, others as self-mythologizing. What critics could not deny was Bardot's emotional exhaustion. Liberation later wrote that the film felt like a star burning down her own image. After its release, Bardot vanished from cinema, permanently. For Brigitte Bardot, love was never a place of rest. It was an escape route, a temporary shelter from a world that never stopped watching her. For Brigitte Bardot, relationships were never about permanence. They were routes of survival, entered quickly, and exited when the walls closed in. She married Roger Vadim at 18, not out of certainty but out of need. Vadim introduced her to cinema, sculpted her screen image, and pushed her toward the sensual roles that would redefine European film. As her fame exploded, the balance shifted. Control replaced affection, distance replaced intimacy, and the marriage collapsed under ambition and infidelity, leaving Bardot famous before she was emotionally ready for it. Her union with Jacques Charrier proved far more damaging. Charrier could not tolerate her independence or global attention. Their marriage turned bitter and violent, driven by jealousy and resentment. Motherhood arrived during this chaos, and Bardot later admitted she felt trapped rather than fulfilled. When the marriage ended, she made the decision that would haunt her legacy, walking away from both husband and child. The public never forgave her, and she never fully forgave herself. With Gunter Sachs, love became spectacle. He offered wealth, worship, and excess. Rose petals dropped from helicopters, headlines filled with luxury. But beneath the glamour was emotional emptiness. The marriage shimmered briefly, then dissolved, proving that admiration could not substitute understanding. Her final marriage to Bernard Dormal marked withdrawal rather than romance. Quiet, insular, and lasting until her death, it coincided with her retreat from public life and a hardening of her political views. With him, Bardot stopped performing altogether, not just on screen, but for the world. Across 4 marriages, Bardot never searched for stability. She searched for escape. And when escape failed, she chose solitude. Brigitte Bardot's only child, Nicolas Jacques Charrier, was born on January 11, 1960, during her marriage to Jacques Charrier. But his arrival marked one of the darkest chapters of her life, not a moment of joy. Bardot later admitted she was emotionally incapable of becoming a mother. Pregnancy to her felt like captivity. Abortion was illegal in France at the time, and in her own words, she felt trapped in a body she no longer controlled. Years later, she would confess that she tried to end the pregnancy herself, punching her stomach, pleading with doctors for morphine. Revelations that stunned even her most loyal admirers. After Nicolas was born, Bardot collapsed psychologically. Depression followed almost immediately, accompanied by suicide attempts and a deep sense of panic. She refused to breastfeed and said she felt no maternal instinct at all. She once explained that whenever she held the baby, he cried. Not out of need, but because he sensed her agitation and fear. Bardot described herself as immature, unstable, and unfit for motherhood, a level of candor almost unheard of for a public figure at the time. The marriage to Charrier disintegrated soon afterward. When they divorced in 1962, custody of Nicolas was granted to his father and paternal grandparents. Bardot did not fight the decision. Nicolas was raised away from her world, largely shielded from fame, while his mother continued her career and her inner battles. For decades, there was virtually no relationship between them. The distance became permanent, emotional rather than geographical. The rupture turned public in the mid-1990s when Bardot published her autobiography Initiales BB. The memoir was brutally honest and deeply damaging. In it, she described her pregnancy in dehumanizing terms, likening it to a tumor, and wrote that she would have preferred to give birth to a dog rather than a child. These words were not framed as private anguish, but printed plainly for the world to read. She also revisited her marriage to Charrier in graphic detail, intertwining her resentment, fear, and rejection of motherhood into a single narrative. Nicolas and his father responded by taking Bardot to court in 1997. Under French law, publishing intimate details about another person's private life, especially a child, without consent is a civil offense. The court ruled against Bardot and ordered her to pay €17,000 in damages, acknowledging the emotional harm caused by her words. The case became one of the most painful controversies of her later life, not because it involved politics or public opinion, but because it exposed an irreparable fracture between mother and son. Unlike her other scandals, this one could not be dismissed as provocation or free speech. It revealed something far more unsettling, that Bardot's fiercest rebellion was not against society or fame, but against motherhood itself. And the cost of that rebellion was permanent. Nicolas, unlike earlier years, refused to remain silent. Beyond pursuing legal action, he later offered his own reflections, quietly challenging the version of events presented in Bardot's memoirs and attempting to restore dignity to both himself and his father. It was one of the rare moments when Bardot's narrative no longer went unopposed, and the public took notice. Time softened, but did not erase the damage. In later years, mother and son re-established limited contact. Bardot reportedly promised she would never again speak publicly about him, an unspoken admission that her words had caused lasting harm. By then, Nicolas had built a life deliberately distant from her fame, becoming a husband and father himself, choosing privacy where his mother had never been allowed or able to find it. Fame, for Bardot, had never been a prize. From the moment it arrived, it felt like confinement. Paparazzi stalked her relentlessly, waiting outside her home, chasing her through streets, forcing their way into moments that should have remained private. Love affairs, arguments, and breakdowns became spectacle. She felt stripped of dignity, reduced to an image people believed they owned. What the world called glamour she experienced as constant pressure, the inability to walk freely, love quietly, or suffer in peace. That pressure fed a long, relentless depression. Years before her retirement, Bardot was already unraveling, plagued by insomnia, panic, and emotional numbness. She attempted suicide multiple times, not as theater or protest, but as an escape from a life she felt powerless to control. Acting only intensified the damage. To her, performance meant exposure, and admiration felt invasive rather than affirming. She once described being on set as standing naked before strangers, watched, judged, and consumed. Later in life, illness added another layer of withdrawal. Bardot battled breast cancer privately, refusing sympathy, interviews, or public narratives. Treatment came quietly, away from cameras, consistent with a woman who had learned that attention offered no protection, only intrusion. Surviving the illness reinforced what she had come to believe after decades in the spotlight. Fame could amplify everything except dignity. Solitude, not applause, became her final refuge. By the early 1970s, Brigitte Bardot understood a truth few stars ever admit. Remaining famous might kill her. The spotlight no longer felt survivable. She feared she would either lose her sanity or take her own life if she continued. Leaving cinema was not a strategic decision or a dramatic gesture. It was self-preservation. In 1973, after completing her final film, she simply disappeared from the industry. There were no farewell interviews, no victory laps, no indulgence in nostalgia. She refused red carpets, rejected film festivals held in her honor, and declined Lifetime Achievement Awards. The woman the world adored insisted that her past no longer belonged to her. Unlike other icons, she never wavered. A comeback was never discussed, even privately. Bardot believed cinema had already taken too much: her youth, her privacy, her mental stability, her sense of self. Returning would have meant reopening wounds she had barely survived. Decades later, when offered enormous sums of money, she still said no. The door was not merely closed, it was sealed. Walking away cost her relevance, admiration, and the affection of audiences who wanted her frozen in time. But it saved her life. She retreated to Saint-Tropez, avoided interviews, lived quietly, and poured her emotional energy into animal rights activism, the one cause that gave her purpose without demanding exposure. In the decades after she walked away from cinema, Brigitte Bardot's public voice shifted from films and fashion to politics and cultural identity. And it was in this arena that her name became deeply divisive. She became known not only for animal rights activism, but also for repeatedly making inflammatory statements about immigration, Islam, and ethnic minorities. Statements that, in France, crossed legal lines and resulted in multiple convictions for inciting racial hatred. Beginning in the late 1990s, Bardot used her platform and her writing to express alarm over what she called the Islamization of France, warning that the country was being invaded by Muslim immigrants and criticizing Muslim religious practices, particularly ritual slaughter associated with festivals like Eid al-Adha. She framed many of these remarks in the language of animal welfare, but courts and critics saw them as targeting a religious and cultural group, rather than merely critiquing a practice. French courts repeatedly found her language to be racially discriminatory. Between 1997 and the 2000s, she was fined multiple times for her public statements, for accusing Muslims of destroying French culture, for warning about uncontrolled infiltration of immigrants, and for describing France as burdened by a population imposing their acts. In one case, a Paris court imposed a €15,000 fine for comments she made in a 2006 letter to then Interior Minister Nicolas Sarkozy, in which she protested Muslim ritual slaughter and said she was tired of being led by the nose by this population that is destroying us. Her controversial rhetoric did not stop with Islam. In a 2019 open letter, Bardot described the inhabitants of Réunion Island, a diverse French overseas territory, as having kept their savage genes and invoked disparaging stereotypes about their traditions. A French court fined her €20,000 for these remarks in 2021, the largest fine she received in these cases. Beyond religion and nationality, Bardot's writings also included other controversial commentary. In her 2003 book Un cri dans le silence, A Scream in the Silence, she criticized racial mixing, immigration, and aspects of modern culture in broadly sweeping terms, and made remarks about gay culture that were widely condemned as dismissive and insensitive. Some supporters defended her by saying that she was motivated by concerns over animal cruelty or cultural change, and that her emotional language was misinterpreted. But in the eyes of the law and many critics, her repeated emphasis on invasion, destruction, and genetic purity crossed into racial prejudice rather than cultural critique. Anti-racism groups such as MRAP brought several of the cases against her, and prosecutors repeatedly pointed out that France's strict anti-hate speech laws apply to all forms of discriminatory incitement, regardless of the speaker's fame. Bardot's political alignment also contributed to the controversy. After her marriage to Bernard Dormal, a former advisor to the far-right National Front, now National Rally, she publicly supported leaders such as Jean-Marie Le Pen and Marine Le Pen, praising their stances on immigration and French identity. In interviews and later writings, she spoke approvingly of Marine Le Pen's criticism of halal practices and championed what she saw as defending French culture, a framing that resonated with the far right but alienated many of her former admirers. By the time of her death, Bardot had been convicted at least 5 to 6 times for racial hatred, one of the highest numbers for a French cultural figure, and her political statements had become as much a part of her public memory as her films. These controversies ensured that her legacy would be seen as complex and polarizing, an undeniable cinematic icon whose later voice stirred deep divisions in a changing France. Brigitte Bardot did not quit because she failed. She quit because success was destroying her. She died at the age of 91 on December 28, 2025. Her death was confirmed by the Brigitte Bardot Foundation, the animal rights organization she led for decades. She passed away at her home in Saint-Tropez, La Madrague, the villa overlooking the Mediterranean, where she had lived for more than 50 years after leaving cinema behind. Tributes followed swiftly. French President Emmanuel Macron called her a legend of the century, acknowledging her immeasurable influence on French culture and global cinema. On January 7, 2026, a solemn funeral service was held at Notre-Dame de l'Assomption Church in Saint-Tropez, honoring both the woman and the town that became inseparable from her identity. She was laid to rest in the Marine Cemetery overlooking the sea, a quiet, final place for someone who had spent a lifetime trying to escape being seen. Brigitte Bardot leaves behind a legacy that is neither simple nor comfortable, but unmistakable. A woman who reshaped film, celebrity, and cultural imagination, then chose life over legend.